Well, after a remarkable introduction like that, the wisest thing is to sit down, because you can only be downhill from there. It is quite right that Jeanette and I go back a long time, and neither of us will indulge your prurient interest as to just how long ago it was. But we were, in our salad days, in a small church-related college, centrally isolated, as we described it, in Lewiston, Maine. And it was in the college chapel, a Gothic space, a lot darker than this place, a lot less hospitable in many ways, where 3 days a week, under compulsion, the college gathered for required chapel. We sat in assigned seats with monitors in the gallery taking attendance. And they were always smarter than we. You would try to squinch up against somebody or duck around, but they never failed to count you. And if you failed to attend chapel, it had an effect upon your grade point average. So we were not particularly pious, but we were dutiful. The smartest of us, like Jeanette and myself, sang in the chapel choir. And in the chancel, we could sit down beneath these very high pews and prepare for our 10 o'clock classes. At least I did. I'm sure Jeanette listened to every sermon preached in the Bates Chapel. But I, having some anticipation of my own career, decided later I did not need to listen very carefully. But never did I think in my wildest imagination of the particular journey that I would find myself on, or the destination, or the way stations that I would encounter along the way. And I suspect that in our wildest fantasies back then, Jeanette and I never imagined that we would meet under such splendid auspices here in the heartland of America. So I believe in providence, and I believe in opportunity, and I believe very much in the blessings that orchestrate our life far beyond our wildest imaginations. When I was a freshman at Bates, for the freshman assembly, we were all gathered, not in the chapel, but in the gymnasium. And our parents sat behind us, and we all sat in the front. The president, I don't know whether you do this, but the president of the day gave a time-worn speech. He would say, "Young men and women of Bates, look to the right, look to the left of you. One of you will not be here in 4 years." Well, I had an aisle seat, so that my odds of success were terribly marginalized by that. And so I really do thank what gods there be for the fact that, one, I was allowed to go to Bates, two, I was allowed to remain there, and three, I was privileged to graduate from there. As we were driving around earlier this afternoon in the light, and I noticed the lineaments of this campus and the carefully tended shrubbery. I understand this is an arboretum of sorts. It put me very much in mind of my undergraduate days. And so I want to say to those of you who are undergraduate members of this college, you probably don't know at the moment how fortunate you are, but you are indeed privileged and fortunate. And the older you get, the more affection you will feel for your college. That is why college presidents hope that the students live forever, because the older you are, the fonder the memories, the more generous you are. Now, I looked over the list of previous Quest lecturers here, and I must say, quite frankly, I was intimidated. I suspect I was meant to be. I'm a trustee of a lectureship at Harvard, which began in 1892, and we list all of the great and the good who've done these lectures. And this year, the lecturer wrote me and said, "Please, whatever you do, don't print all of the people who have given the lecture before I have, or if you do, please don't send it to me. It is intended to induce premature silence." you look at this list and say, my goodness, what a tumble off from the beginning this has been. And when I looked at where this started and actually saw a man whom I admire greatly, Robert Ballard here, who must have delighted you with tales of the discovery of the Titanic and finding all sorts of things on the ocean floor, and with images of Leonardo DiCaprio floating in front of undergraduate female eyes, I suspect that that was a great hit. And here we are, some years after that fact, and I don't have anything of that sort to share with you, though rather than a shipwreck, I suppose I might describe myself as a bit of a fossil, and fossils are worth looking at because they are evidences of life. Remember that. Fossils are evidences of life. So if anything, I am an evidence of a life still lived, still in search, still engaged in a great and noble quest. Now let me begin by saying, particularly to undergraduates, if there happen to be any in the house, that my life has been a series of unplanned adventures. Now, I'm surrounded by Harvard undergraduates all the time who spend all of their considerable energy trying to orchestrate and plan every detail of their lives. No undergraduate that I know of these days wants to be surprised or taken unawares. And so when my freshman advisees come to see me, they've been in college 3 or 4 days. And usually they'll come to me with a completely worked out chart of courses for the next 4 years. They will have anticipated deaths, retirements, resignations, the occasional scandal, and even firing. They have it all there, every contingency accounted for, and they're so proud of themselves that they have mapped this all out, and they want me to stamp it and say, go thou and live by this and come back and see me in 4 years. Well, with many of them, I'd be quite happy not to see them until 4 years, but it's my job to call in on them from time to time. And every once in a while, I sort of say, well, you seem to have this all perfectly well worked out and planned. Suppose something happens to you along the way that might change your mind. And they'll say, oh, no, there will be nothing to change my mind, sir. I have this all organized. I'm going to major in some dreary subject like economics. Any economic concentrators or majors here in the house, if you are, it's not what you think it is. It's even more boring and less reliable than ever. You may as well study meteorology. Economics is a lot like meteorology, don't you think? You can sort of predict, and then your predictions don't work, and then you can describe what happened. And they pay you to do that. They want something solid, and so I'll say to them, well, suppose you actually read a book that turns you on and sends you to look at Mayan pottery. Or you go to a concert and you hear some extraordinary music and you decide you want to discover the quartets of Beethoven. Or you hear a visiting lecturer in political science and you want to give your life to international disarmament or something or other. Suppose something like that comes up and there's a deadly silence and they say, well, that will really ruin my plans. That's not quite the answer that I had in mind. And so I tell them, well, look, my life is a testimony to extraordinary interventions, acts of providence and surprise, and nothing that I am doing or where I am doing it is anything that I, at least, could have predicted, and certainly nothing that I planned. It seems to me that the joy of college, particularly in an undergraduate college, such as this one and such as the one that Jeanette and I went to, is that you are primed and opened up for surprise, for wonderment, for discovery. But that seems so out of fashion. But I am grateful. I testify to the fact that Providence is not just a small town in Rhode Island, that it actually does have a role to play as one tries to make one's way, one's quest, to use the terminology of this endowment, in the world. And I'm excited by that and grateful for it. Samuel Johnson, the Dr. Johnson of the dictionary, is one of my great heroes, one of my favorite figures from the 18th century. And if you don't know anything about Dr. Johnson, it's time you did. You don't have to read Boswell's rather tedious and sycophantic history or biography of Dr. Johnson, though you'll get a lot of credit if you do. But what you really should do is read the biography of Johnson by Dr. Walter Jackson Bate, my late colleague at Harvard. It's the best biography of Dr. Johnson that there is. And in Jack Bate's biography, there is a chapter on Dr. Johnson's favorite books, 3 favorite books, which most affected him and which he read over and over and over again. The first was Don Quixote by Cervantes. And Dr. Johnson liked this story of a foolish, naive, idealistic adventurer who was always getting into trouble, literally tilting at windmills, but whose perseverance brought into being the impossible dream. There was something very dreamer-like in Don Quixote. And Dr. Johnson, that sensible 18th century coffee-drinking English lexicographer, liked Don Quixote. That was one of his favorite books. His second favorite book was the story of Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, a kind of 18th century high adventure book. If The Matrix were written in the 18th century, it would look very much like Robinson Crusoe. And if you try to put that together, you'll be tempted to go out and read it, and I hope you will. Robinson Crusoe is too important a book to be left simply to the English mages and the professors of 18th century civilization. Dr. Johnson saw in Robinson Crusoe the improvisatory life. Your ship is wrecked. You have to take what you can from the ruins and create a whole new existence on a desert island. Aren't you tempted to do that sometime? I know I am, and I love the fact that this was an important book for this great man. So, Don Quixote, the idealistic knight-errant, and Robinson Crusoe, the improvisatory adventurer shipwrecked. And the third book, the third favorite book, was by another Englishman, and that is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Now, Pilgrim's Progress is probably the least known of the 3 books that I've just mentioned, even in this old Christian school. Now, I went into the trustees' room earlier. The president took me in and showed me around, and I don't know if you've ever been in that room. Maybe you're not allowed in that room. It's a real holy of holies. You get that sense right away. And there are an awful lot of very grim Christians hanging all around the wall. I mean, terrifying looking men, doubtless all very reformed, I'm sure. Now, I would guarantee that they knew Pilgrim's Progress, and they would have been able to recite it by heart, but it's sort of fallen out of popular parlance. But Dr. Johnson liked it because it was a book about a pilgrimage, a movement from the known to the unknown. And through all sorts of misadventures, the Slough of Despond, the Valley of Despair, Vanity Fair, the House of the Interpreter, all these wonderful places along the way where Pilgrim has adventures and misadventures and more adventures. I find very appealing this notion of being a knight-errant, shipwrecked pilgrim in a strange and wonderful world where I am led even more than I lead, where I am guided even more than I am directed. And that adds to the sense of vocation and the excitement of vocation in life, which has been mine for these many years. People say, "How did you get to Harvard?" And I know exactly what they mean when they say that. What an unlikely match or mix you would appear to be. And somebody say, "You must have plotted and planned and schemed and developed and coordinated, just like all the freshmen do to get into college, in order to reach that point." Well, it was nothing of the kind. It was luck. It was a stroke of genius on their part, I might say. And one day I wasn't there, and the next day I was, and I've been there ever since. It had to do, to a certain degree, with a timely intervention by a Bates professor. And to this day, I can mark the very spot on the walk where the intervention took place. It was in September of my senior year in college. And I was walking back to the main quadrangle. It was right between Carnegie Science and the library. And Dwight Walsh stopped me in the path. And he said, "You think you're a pretty clever fellow, don't you?" Well, I recognized that as a challenge, and I could never resist the challenge. And so I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Well, you've had it all your own way here at Bates. Why don't you go where people are smarter than you are and see if you can deal with this religious stuff as cavalierly as you have dealt with it here?" So, not willing to back down, I said, "Well, what do you have in mind, sir?" And he said, "Why don't you go down to Harvard Divinity School for a year? What's a year? Test yourself out against the brightest and the best, and if you like it, you stay, and if you don't like it, you can go on to what you were thinking you wanted to do, which was to be a historian. That was to be my life's work and my calling." I thought of religion as a diversion for weak-minded people. Now, I grew up in the church, so I knew what I was speaking about. My church, the First Baptist Church of Plymouth, was filled with sweet, loving, empty-headed Christians. And I loved them, but I didn't want to be like them. And when I went off to college and discovered that Jonah didn't swallow the whale and all sorts of other remarkable things, I put away, as St. Paul would say, childish things, and I was going to be an historian. The Christian religion, while useful and interesting, it was not for me. I wanted to be an intellectual. And I, for the best part of my undergraduate career, strived to be just that. But this professor caught me out. He knew me better than I knew myself. He played me like a violin, set this thing up that my vanity could not resist, and sent me to Harvard. I thought, well, they won't admit me. Well, they did. I said, well, they'll admit me, but they won't give me any money. I can't afford to go. Well, they gave me more money than I could have possibly imagined. I thought, this will be an interruption in my proposed course of study at Winterthur in Delaware. Well, they deferred my admission. There was no way I could get out of this. It really was like Jonah going to Nineveh. No way could you avoid this particular experience. And, as they say, the rest is history. I did go to Harvard, and I discovered that it was possible to be both a believer and a thinker. It was possible to have a mind that was engaged together with the heart in the life of faith. I'd never seen that before. Smart people I knew weren't religious. Religious people I knew weren't smart. It was at Harvard where I saw the two come together. One of my teachers, I know I must mention the sacred name here, one of my teachers was Richard Reinhold Niebuhr, son of your president, nephew of the man with the condom out front. And I sat at his feet, and many like him, if you don't know what that reference is, you'd better go look at the statue. I saw it at 5 o'clock, and it is suitably dressed. There I saw people for whom the Christian faith came together in a remarkable blend of mind and feeling, and added to that a sense of appropriate action. And my life was changed by that experience, and I devoted it, at that moment I decided that I would devote my life to trying to make that transaction possible for other people. That was a glorious quest for me. And so one of the reasons that I'm with you tonight is that I am sharing that quest of mind and heart and spirit with people very much like my young self, whom I presume to be your good selves. So my vocation was formed in that remarkable setting, and with the exception of 2 years, I have been in that place, applying that trade, working that craft ever since. And it has been the most exciting and rewarding enterprise of my life so far. So to the question that is the title assigned me in this evening's lecture, can you take your faith to work? The obvious answer for me is, of course I can. It's what I do, morning, noon, and night. I take my faith to work every day because my faith is my work. And I couldn't think of a more engaging or satisfying way to spend one's life than this life in the teaching ministry that has been mine for these many years. Now, the great thing about teaching at a place like Bates or Elmhurst or Harvard is that those of us who teach inevitably are teaching people, yourselves, who are smarter than we are. You're smarter, but we know more. Now, there's a point where those come together. Your brightness and our knowledge may come together. And we anticipate this, which is why we get rid of you every 4 years. And we leave it for you to try to compete out there in the real world with people who may be even smarter than you are. It's a great and glorious enterprise, the life of the mind in a university. And for one whose job in the university is as a preacher as well as a teacher, it is all the more exciting and compelling and demanding. One of my predecessors as the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals, George Arthur Buttrick, was well known around the world as perhaps the greatest and most famous preacher in the English language. And then as now, our Sunday services in Memorial Church are broadcast on the radio. So you have thousands and thousands of people out there listening. You don't know who's out there, but they know you. And Dr. Buttrick told this story that one Monday after he was preaching, he went to lunch in the faculty club. And if there's anything more formidable than Harvard students, it's the Harvard faculty. And he sat down opposite some renowned physicist. And the physicist said to him, Dr. Buttrick, I heard your sermon on the radio yesterday, and it was arrant nonsense. And George pulled himself up, was about to reply to that, and he said, I don't know anybody who could possibly believe a word that you said. And so he was ready to fire off a reply, and the professor said, I don't believe it, but I believe that you do, and I suppose that's what counts in a preacher. Now, that's not exactly a conversion story, and that would not rate high on the evangelical witnessing meter, I know. But given Harvard and given the world, that was not a bad position in which to be. To be believed to believe what it is you profess with your lips and with your mind. That is an exciting challenge, and it's one on which I thrive. People wonder about the nature of work. They'll ask the question, for example, are you what you do? You encounter some people and you say, oh, well, who are you? I'm a butcher, or I'm a baker, or I'm an astronaut, or I'm a politician, and whatnot. Reminds me of that famous epitaph in Vermont, to John Jones, born a man, died a grocer. It is a rather sad declension from your noble calling as a child of God, a son or a daughter of God. I am more than what I do. What I do is an extension of what I am, but it is not the same thing. And the message that I have both received and tried to communicate over all of my life is, do not be defined exclusively by what you do. For what you do, your work, your job, is merely a means to some larger end. And what, dare we ask, is that larger end? Well, it rests upon the useful distinction between a job and a vocation. I have a vocation. I have and enjoy a calling. And it has been the great joy of my life that such talents and skills, interests, abilities, and opportunities as I may have come together to enable me to do the thing to which I believe I am called. In the old days, people used to ask, do you have a calling? What is the calling that you are going to follow? Rarely do you hear that nowadays, unless you're talking about nuns or priests or religious people. Most of you would be just satisfied with a job. I'll take whatever is coming down the pike and worry about whether I'm called to it later on. You may want a call back, but a calling is something else again. I want to try to rehabilitate the notion of calling, or to use its more pretentious word, its classier word, a vocation, a vocare, an invitation. And the best definition I have ever heard of a calling or a vocation in this sense is that of the theologian Frederick Buechner. And Fred Buechner defines a vocation in this way: where your great joy meets the world's great need. Where your great joy meets the world's great need. That is a calling. That is a vocation. And the thing that I wish for people when I go to colleges like this and end up speaking at commencements and baccalaureates is, I pray God that you find a calling and not just a job. And the nature of that calling involves this connection with your joy and the world's need. Now, when I look out at college audiences these days, I don't see much joy there. What a joyless, tight-lipped bunch of folks you tend to be. Get a lot of Christians in the room and the joy quotient goes down just like that. There's something to be concerned about. I mean, I even watch my happy, clappy Christian friends, and they're all waving and moving, but they don't look very happy. Joy is a very precious and hard to come by commodity, but you know it when you have it. It means that there has been a connection between your talent, your skill, and your opportunity, and a job that needs doing, a need that is waiting to be filled. And I think Fred Buechner is on to something very incisive when he makes this connection between your great joy, the thing that gives you pleasure and satisfaction, and the world's great need, something that you can help fulfill. I spend my time with a lot of people who have a lot of impressive jobs and who are generally miserable in their work. It's not because they don't have a lot of money in their work. They do. It's not because they don't have a lot of power or influence. Most of them do. In fact, most of them have far too much power and influence in their work. But when you ask them, are you happy? they'll usually evade the question by saying, well, what a silly question that is. I mean, I'm the editor of the New York Times. Who expects to be happy as editor of the New York Times? I run things. That's what I do. Or I am, you can fill in the blank. You know such people. Joy is a very rare and precious commodity in our work. And so the most radical advice I can give anybody is that if you've got no joy in your work, you're in the wrong job. Get out as fast as you can. What irresponsible counsel, hardly sufficiently reformed, indeed, maybe even not all entirely congregational, dangerous as a matter of fact. But let me ask you this, let's be practical. Does the world need one more joyless captive of his or her work? Do we need one more unhappy bank teller? You go into the bank, yes. Would you cash this? You have an account here. Yes. How would you like to, could I get it in 20s? You got enough to cover this? I mean, you want to say, are you happy? Do you have joy in your work? You, my dear lady, are a prime candidate for quitting. Why don't you just leave now? Close the cash drawer, get your hat and coat, and go away. We'll all be happier as a result of this. Now, I know that that does sound frivolous and irresponsible, but the point I'm trying to make is how many people do we know who have given themselves over to a dutiful existence, managing, when in fact, with a little more effort, they could flourish in joy because they were doing something worthwhile and indeed for others. Because that's the connection in this, where your great joy meets the world's great need. When I was an undergraduate in college, the Peace Corps was invented in Mr. Kennedy's administration. Now, those remarkable 100 days. And a moment of great optimism and opportunity spread through the world, a world that had been filled with the dangers and rumors of war and the kinds of antagonisms that the Cold War generated. Here was a ray of light. Young men and women from America would go out to do good in the world because it was a good thing to do and it would make them feel good. There's nothing wrong with doing good and feeling good about doing good. It helps make you good, and that's a good thing. It seems to me to discover that is to discover that vocation trumps job every time. Now, as I look out among this audience, the little I can see with that light blinding me in the face, I look out and I see that there are many for whom my message tonight is too late. There is nothing I can do about that. You've made your choices. You're struggling on as best you can. God bless you. And what's a heaven for? I understand that. But there are a few of you out here, few undergraduates, perhaps a senior or two, for whom it is not yet too late to discover your vocation and not just your next job. Will you be a knight errant, tilting at the terrific windmills out there that need to be tilted at? Or maybe you will be set adrift in a great ocean and land on a desert island, and you will have to be recreating a new society in some way. Or maybe you will be making a long pilgrimage from the known to the unknown. You have a chance. You, 19 or 20 or 21 or 25 or 28-year-old, you have a chance. And in fact, so too do the rest of you, do the rest of us. They just have more opportunity than we do. And maybe, dare I say it, a little more courage. Now, if some 72-year-old lady out there tonight says, praise the Lord, I'm not going into the office tomorrow, I am going to become a this, that, and the other, I will salute you and bless you, and I just hope it's the right thing to do. It takes courage to listen to the calling, to make your vocation a part of the way you define your life and not be defined by your job. I knew nothing of Mr. Quest, who endowed this, except by the fact that he was graced with a most extraordinary name and a very generous set of executors. It is a very good notion to be talking on a foundation that has at its root the quest for life, for value, for meaning, for vocation. I think that is indeed the way to be able to answer the question positively: can you take your faith to work? If you are doing work worthy of your faith, of course you can take it to work. Now, I don't want to suggest by this or leave the impression that taking your faith to work is essentially doing on Monday what might best be done on Sunday. I don't necessarily think that what you should do is witness in the checkout aisle of the local market. You make a lot of people pretty mad if instead of making change and getting the bags, you ask them about their personal relationship with Jesus at that moment. Slip them a card if you want to, see them later, but taking a faith to work in that way is not really quite, I think, what we have in mind here. But what we do have in mind here is that can you be an example, and indeed an exemplar of your faith at work, working? That's something different. Can people look at you and say in your work, Audrey's a strange duck. She doesn't seem to respond to all these hassles and pressures like everybody else. I hear she's a Christian. Let's find out. Is she? That is taking your faith to work and making it work. It is witnessing in the daily discharge of your duties, mundane or exciting, high or low, so that people will look at you and say, what is it that makes so-and-so tick? What is it that makes so-and-so unlike other people? What is it that makes so-and-so somebody we want to talk to, or whom we hope will talk to us? Remember that passage in the Bible where Jesus talks about setting your light on a candle? He says, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. In other words, don't give them a testimony, give them a life. Don't give them an explanation, give them an experience. Let you be the witness to the faith which is in you, and people will ask you about it. And when they do, the rest could very well be history. So we're talking about values as well as vocation, the things that matter and the things that work. Those are the things, it seems to me, that make the difference between being merely an educated person and a person of wisdom and wit and genuine knowledge. And our great hope in these liberal arts colleges is that in addition to all the things that we certify, we will be turning out whole people who will themselves be witnesses to the combination of faith and reason, of mind and heart, of experience and expectation. For in investing as heavily as your ancestors and your parents do in this college, as in my college and as at Harvard, the expectation is more than a mere certification of head knowledge. And even that, at times, is very difficult to certify. We take a lot on faith. Harvard has been graduating people without interruption since 1642. And look at the mess the world is in as a result of that. I sometimes think, let's have a moratorium on all college graduations. 1 year, we graduate nobody. And I bet things would righten themselves out. Might be a lot nicer and a lot better. But we'd all go out of business. We can't do that. So our hope is that the ones that we do educate in privileged places like this will be educated in heart and mind to find and follow a vocation that makes a difference both in the world and in their own lives, where joy and where need come together. Now, will you be successful at that? The development office wants to know, will you be successful in this ambition? Well, you're not paying me enough to predict the success rate of your class. I have no idea. We'll just have to wait and see, but I can hope. And I can give you a piece of advice when things are not going well. It was Winston Churchill, one of my great heroes, who said, when you are in hell, keep going. Not a bad thought, remember. When you're in hell, when things are terrible, just don't stay there and say, this is awful. Keep moving, keep going, and don't look back. They're gaining at every step of the way. I don't know whether you will succeed, but I do know that if you don't try, and if you don't try to seek out this vocation like the overtone of a tuning fork, you will miss out on one of the great joys and adventures of life. You have come and filled the chapel this evening, and you want to get Mr. Quest's money's worth, and I want to give it to you. And so the way that I can do that is to close with an appropriate reference to one of the great dead white men who used to be taught regularly in places like this. I refer, of course, to Aristotle. You can write that down. Tell them the man from Harvard talked about Aristotle, and they'll all be impressed. Aristotle gave a wonderful definition of what is for me the ultimate goal in all of this. And the ultimate goal, you may be surprised to hear me, a reasonably Calvinistical preacher, say the ultimate goal is not service or duty or labor. The ultimate goal is happiness. Happiness. Happiness is a hard thing to sell among people of our sort. Hard working, bottom line, doctrinally pure and clear sons and daughters of the Midwest. Happiness is not what you're into at the moment. They have happiness in California, and they have happiness in Mexico, and they may have lurid pleasures in New York, but happiness is not what we do here at Elmhurst College. Well, I've got some news for you. Happiness is what you should be about because Aristotle said so, and the reason he said so is that in the absence of it, life is even gloomier than Garrison Keillor describes it, and that you do not want. How does Aristotle describe happiness? Well, let me give you his definition, which is I write in my appointment book every year, and I hold it to my heart. He says, happiness is the exercise of vital powers along lines of excellence in a life affording them scope. It is a perfect definition of what college ought to be. The exercises of vital powers. The undergraduates have never been more acute, more vital than they are now. And those of us who look back upon our undergraduate days remember we seem to be just trudging along, but we were at the peak of some extraordinary moment, and in a way it's been downhill ever since. We are at the peak at this moment where you're locked up here in Elmhurst College. Your hormones are raging. You're at your sexual peak. That's why they don't want you to do anything. Your mind is never more receptive than it is now. Mathematicians peak before 27, and then they just write about what they once did. The exercise of vital powers. Look at the athletes in the college. Look at the musicians. Look at the people who can stay up all night, attend class, get the right answers, run around, do all of the good works in town, and never run out of energy or spiritual gas. You're at your peak. So you're supposed to exercise these vital powers along lines of excellence. That is to say, they are to be devoted to the very best you can possibly do. And when you see young people performing at the top of their form, the very best that they can do, whether it's athletes or musicians or artists or scholars, it is a beautiful thing to see. It is exciting to see. It's one of the joys of teaching, to watch a bright young mind exercised along lines of excellence. And then the great ambition, of course, is a life that affords these talents scope, room to grow, space in which to develop, a universe to conquer, or at least fail gloriously in trying to do so. Ambition, great expectations. What a wonderful moment and place it is to be young, filled with such powers and aiming for such great expectations. Even those of us who live off the fumes of our memories of those experiences are still stimulated by them. And we look upon you with such envy, delight, and joy. That is true happiness, the exercise of vital powers along lines of excellence in a life, affording them scope. That's what it's all about. That is what true happiness is. And you know that true happiness in the exercise of a genuine vocation that will last for the rest of your life. Can you take your faith to work? Interesting question. Go to the NEBA Center. I'm sure they have an answer or two for you. But I think it's not quite the right question. The right question is, can your faith work for you? The answer is, of course it can. In a life affording it scope, with a sense of vocation that fashions your talents and skills, and a recognition, clear-eyed, analytical, and without deception, of the great needs and opportunities of this very needy and difficult world. There is no better adventure in life than that, no better quest in life than that, and no better place to prepare for it than in a place like Elmhurst College. You are so fortunate to be here, but may I say, no more fortunate than I. Thank you.